So as I said, it turns out to be a controversial issue. Academics who would tweet at each other if Twitter existed. So funny. Okay, natural branching networks. Are they random? Are they optimal? You know, what is it? Or some of that should be really or both, I suppose. Messing with my slides, or not. So we'll go through it. We'll look at just a single junction first. This is an old observation. It's quite a beautiful one, and then we'll get to the big story. Okay. So we have these this is definitely true, right? Self-similar networks, you know, there's some scaling or whatever is a little bit messy and they vary. I think I did show you, yes, I showed you a list of branching ratios for organisms, and they varied in interesting ways. I never published that table actually. So this is what I'm trying to say here, I suppose, that real networks, they differ in the details of the scaling, right? They could be higher branching ratios, lower branching ratios, the lengths and so on could scale in different ways. But there's good agreement in the scaling relations, right? So that the sums of exponents seem to match up. So even something like the Scheidegger network, which is just this random network story, its scaling relations are the same basically as real ones, even though the actual numbers, the exponents are quite different. So that's okay, that's good. So something I want to kind of say, maybe I should preface this. I think, you know, so you imagine organisms growing. We have to sort of get to the same point where we have a network that fills space and does this job of providing nutrients throughout the body. So how that actually branches may not really matter too much. It's just that it does branch and does fill space eventually. So you could have different, if you like, algorithms essentially that result in the same thing. So I think across species you might have different, you know, variations, but the details don't matter so much. It's just that there really is this kind of branching, and a couple of things will matter in the end. Okay, so talked about optimal channel networks. This is Rodriguez-Iturbi and Renato. It's some sort of distant work now. There's some older work, thermodynamics, trying to like use StatMech. Then there's sort of the pure randomness ones, right? So this is often the game, and we saw this with the Simon versus Mandelbrot thing in Parks, right? About language and city sizes, zip distributions. They're really sort of going. Often there's this sort of, these are the extremes that people consider, and usually it's going to be some combination of both. All right, so we're going to talk about this. Optimal forks. We should have advanced work on sporks. That would be good. Optimal sporks. If nothing else, one of the most fun words humans have ever invented. Okay, so Murray's law, as you'd say in Australia, would be Muzz's law. Muzza. Okay, so we're full of these. We're sitting there right now with them, right? With these little forks inside us. And a good question is, you know, how, you know, are these things structured in some sort of way that does a good job in terms of impedance minimization or whatever it is, right? So you know, we don't want our arteries to get blocked, right? We, of course, collectively we're doing a good job at doing that. Because food is delicious, and people make tricky foods. But, you know, we want these things to flow well, and of course evolution probably has done a good job of making things that are fairly efficient in this regard. Again, platypuses, but, you know, there are going to be aspects of optimality all through evolutionary outcomes. All right, so you'll have, let's say, we'll put these three pieces together. We have sort of a parent tube and then offspring tubes. And there'll be lengths, right? So we've got L0, L1, L2, maybe not the best notation. There's some flux, that's the feed, this is a flux, so this is the amount of material per unit time that's coming through. There's also a velocity. So these two pieces are needed, right? Because the cross-sectional area, which is given by this R, will govern how fast the flow is, right? So wider tubes, slower flow for the same flux. And so here's this, hanging out here and I haven't said anything about it, here's this rather spectacular story that for optimal tube structures, and we're talking about in 3 dimensions, right? The parent tube's radius cubed is equal to the sum of these two, which is pretty groovy, right? So this is known as Murray's law. It's very much observed. It's observed for us and other things with blood in them, lots of organisms, at the periphery, right? So it's not so much close to the heart, which is faster flow and can be turbulent and so on, but it's out at the outer edges. Okay, so we're going to drive this because it's kind of a cool result. There is, maybe not. There are some weirder variations. For turbulent flow, it may be that this is like a 7/3 power, but we won't talk about that. Not sure if that really holds up. So, as I said, this is good for outer branchings of blood networks, and it's found for trees. And this is so Murray's law, as it says, is 1926. It's an old thing. This work is 2003, 2004, coming out of the University of Utah. Fred Adler, I think, is the main character there. So the trees are quite interesting things, right? With the xylem is that's the living part on the outside, and the flow has to go up through that from the root system out to the leaves. And it depends on whether how much of that xylem is a supporting structure. So they do a very nice job of showing that when that material of the tree is not really a supporting structure, then that's the stronger Murray's law holds. So that's pretty cool. Darcy Thompson, this famous book that I would recommend you get hold of and just enjoy. On Growth and Form is a polymath and has a piece in there. It has lots of things. Lots of beautiful things. Not everything is true, of course, but he did some great stuff. And a lot of it is focused on this optimization story. Gemerol. That seems to be a mildly contagious thing, right? The State of the Union is tonight, but apparently the tickets, it says the State of the Union. Yeah, all the little tickets, and they're just like little blue tickets. It says the State of the Union. It's pretty great. So there's the State of the Union is stronger. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, typos. But in my defense, I did not have a whole legion of people who were spell check until you guys arrived. Okay, so, and my future self saw what an idiot I was. So it always happens. All right. Anyway, that's a great book. Okay. So how are we going to figure this out? So Ohm's law, right? V equals IR. If you haven't, doesn't matter if you've done electrical engineering or anything. That's sort of you've probably seen that one. There's a hydraulic equivalent, which is the drop in pressure from one end of a tube to another is equal to the flux, which is like current, times impedance. So we need to be able to measure impedance for fluids here. And you can do that, lots of, as we've talked about, fluid mechanics is this incredibly successful field of complex systems. Absolutely a micro to macro story, there are all sorts of things, right? Even figuring out how cats lap milk. So, well done them. But really profoundly successful. So it turns out, and we're not going to do this here, this Poiseuille flow, it's a famous result in fluid dynamics, is that the impedance of a tube is equal to this little beast, right? So we've always have to have pi, so pi is just there. But there's a derivation to get here. This eta is the dynamic viscosity, right? So that's this of course pertains to the fluid that's going through it, so that's the stickiness of it. And then then there are these two pieces, so this is fluid, and then these are geometric, right? So length divided by r to the fourth. Not everything we do with, so actually open channels don't seem to have an impedance, for example, so we can't quite do the same thing with river networks, which is a bit disappointing. But, and this is, we're thinking about fixed solid tubes. It turns out there's a more complicated thing if they're flexible, which of course is the case for us, right? So there's a different calculation for that. All right, So, but the useful thing here is that as length increases, the impedance increases linearly, which makes sense. You double the length of the tube, it's going to be twice as hard to push through. Whereas if you increase radius, right, it really dramatically drops. And so you can think of it as this is the cross-sectional area squared on the bottom. Okay, right, so yeah, you make a bigger tube. The walls effect, because what's going on is you have this parabolic velocity field, and the idea is that, and this is an assumption usually, but it holds up in a lot of cases, that the fluid right next to the wall doesn't move. It's really stuck. And then the fluid, of course, is trying to push, like it's trying to get past itself and get past itself and get past itself. So that kind of, the feel of the wall dissipates as you go towards the middle, where the fastest flow will be, and it turns out the shape will be parabolic. Yeah, okay. So we have a power thing, so power to overcome impedance, right, is going to be flux times these. So this is like VI, right? This is like voltage, this is your current, so it's VI, flux squared times the impedance. You don't have to worry about those things too much, but that's an important result we have to use because we're trying to get to optimality. So this is the cost, right? This is the cost, but at the same time, you also have a metabolic cost, right? So we could make the tubes really wide and then everything would flow through them, but then we've got to have more material, and that's if we're going to kind of keep working on that and making it, say for blood, of course, we have to keep reconstituting it and looking after it and so on, and that's going to simply, the amount of energy that's in the blood or whatever the material is, it's going to be just the proportion to the volume of the cylinder. Yeah.
Is flux based on mass or volume?
So it's volume per unit time. So it's volume per unit time, right? And then you introduce density to turn that into mass or volume. Yeah. I think I said the right thing. Yeah. So is that okay? Yeah. So it's going to be volume, and then depending, because it could be like how much iron or hemoglobin for blood or whatever it is, right? Then you'll say, okay, that's how much of that stuff is moving. Yeah. Good. So we're going to use these results, and this is just a little aside. Right? How much work is done is right, is force times distance, right? So if you push something a certain distance, right, you're one of these CrossFit maniacs and you push sleds with stuff around on it because someone told you to, then that's how much work you're going to do. If you're sitting on a bicycle or whatever, then, or you're a toaster, then this is the rate at work is done, right? It's disappointing that toasters are about as good as humans. Right, there's a video of one of the world champions trying to toast. Yeah? It's like 2 minutes. He has to do 800 watts or something. And the guy is just a heap of muscle attached to bones and things, and just done. Yeah, he toasted it. Really disappointing. Yeah, but yeah, which he needed. But it's like we don't run on. It's really amazing how we run on like 30 watts for a brain or something like that. It's really kind of impressive. And we've built these cool things that, like AI things, of course, like Go, the AlphaGo and so on, but they're using a fair amount of power. Anyway, they'll get there, they'll win. Okay, but power is going to be, so this is, right, the derivative of this thing is velocity, so you can sort of see that. This is for a constant effort. And then, so this, just that things kind of make sense, right? So this is force per unit area, that's the change, pressure is force per unit area. As we said, volume per unit time for flux, and that's cross-sectional area times velocity. So if we multiply those things together, right, if we multiply these two things together, then we have force times velocity, and that's the kind of right thing. That's all, I'm just, yeah.
Can you get a relatively decent approximation for a river system if you just cut something manually?
To get a
Approximation for a river system.
For an impedance, do you mean? No.
Yeah.
I have to look up the details again, but because it's open on the top, you can't arrive the same thing, yeah. Or you can't, there isn't a, I guess what it is there isn't an impedance that depends only on the, say, viscosity or whatever, but the geometry. That's really what you want. You want it to depend on just the shape. That's a good question. Yeah. So we're going to say the total cost or the power, right, to run this system, and we're talking about this little branching thing, is going to be the drag, right? This is how much that you're burning up just trying to push the thing through, and then there's how much you have to use to maintain that amount of fluid. And so the thing we see here is that we've got length, right? It's proportional to length in both cases, right? So if we double the length, we double the power, that's fine. But radius has got some interesting things, right? So it helps us to make wider tubes, but it's going to cost more. So this is a nice little trade-off sort of situation. R's effect is nonlinear, so this is just saying those words. So clearly, if we minimize with respect to radius, we should find some intermediate value, and that's the little game. So we set a thing up, and it doesn't really matter what this constant is. You'd think it might, but it doesn't matter. Of course, it's pi, but we're just adding a constant proportionality because it's pi is for the volume, I should say, and then cost is whatever it takes to make that volume. So that's why it's some more opaque C. Right. All right, so we're just going to differentiate that little beast, right? So this is nothing too bad. This is out of the fourth on the bottom and an r squared here. So we get out of the minus 5, the minus 4 comes out the front. This is r squared, so we get a 2. We're going to set that to 2 times r. We set that equal to 0. And you'll see as we move this around, we're going to get an r to the 6th, right? Put that up here. That'll be an r to the 6th. The lengths will cancel. We're going to get a few constants floating around. But basically, that will be the story. We'll get r to the 6th. We'll put this on the other side. It's going to be negative. And we're going to get flux squared is going to look like, and here it is, is going to be proportional to radius to the 6th. So we'll say this is some constant. Sorry. We'll say this is some constant times r to the 6th. So we have flux is now equal to some constant to r cubed. And that's this piece. And then we need to just simply say this must be true, right? There's no leaking. Otherwise, our organism is really going to be unhappy. So the flux of the parent tube has to equal the flux here and here, added together. And so if we do that, and this K is the same for all of them, then we get Murray's law. So it's a really nice observation that comes out of some fairly great achievements, right? We have to have understood fluid dynamics, which is non-trivial. And the interesting thing is happening in there with that inverse r to the 4. But it gives Murray's law. And as I've said, that holds up for real networks. The outer limits for us, for blood networks, and trees, actually, yeah. Okay, so how am I doing? I'm just going to quickly say this. This is like an unpublished little piece, but it's, you could do this. So, of course, we know that, we've sort of labored over this point, right? That we have mixed hierarchical structures for real branching networks. So they're not, we have these forks. Obviously, we have these little forks, and that the result, the Murray's law piece we just had is true, but we could sort of scale it up to that next level and use Tokunaga's law for side branches, right? So the flux in an order omega pipe has to be equal to 2 times the typical flux you see in the pipes that are coming in, that are order of 1 less, and then all of these side branches. So that would have to sum up, right? So now we've got the flux coming out of an order omega segment. This is the 2 that make it, and then all these side streams. And so this is just Tokunaga's law sort of written out. And given we have Murray's Law story already, you can play around with this, and if you want, we get a Horton ratio for the how the radii scale. We didn't have that before, so that's a nice thing, and we get another connection. So if you have what? One fluid, did you say? Yeah, you have to. It has to be it has to be smooth flow, and it has to be a well mixed thing. So it's be a nice smooth flow. So it is right. So when it's turbulent and so on, this doesn't work. So there are two ways it could go wrong. One is that the flow is too fast and it's turbulent, and then there's also that it really isn't a pipe, which is true for us, right? It's a rigid pipe. It's flexible. Yeah, hopefully flexible. Okay. Anyway, so there are other things you can do here. I feel like maybe I shouldn't go on too much. Well, it's quick, I suppose. You can add a couple of other pieces. There's isometry that the volume around a stream segment is proportional to its length cubed, which would be a nice scaling, so you get all these things collapsing. So we're going to get to West in a minute. This is a very famous thing, 1987. Cannot believe I do not have. I'm in pain. There should be a period here. West kind of gets this, but we'll get to West work soon. John Turcotte, who's a famous geomorphologist, used Tokunaga as well, and used some data from a cat, which is terrible, just terrible. All right. Maybe the cat donated itself to science. Okay, so anyway, so these are just some extra pieces, and yeah, that's all we need to say, I guess, that some of these other Horton-type ratios for, like you can imagine the volume that a stream segment or a tube services, or the radii and so on, that they all can be connected as well. Yeah, okay. All right, that's good. That wasn't as much as I thought, of course.